Hey everybody, Jem Schofield here, and welcome to the Canon XF400 and 405 video training series. In this video, setting up for shooting part 2, we're going to be going into the menu system of the camera system, and I'm going to be showing you some of the key things I think you should know about to set up your camera for your projects. So we access the main menu system by pressing the menu button on the back of the camera body. And as I've said in another video, you can navigate using the joystick here, but the way this camera is set up, it's really much easier to use the touchscreen. So right now we're inside of the camera setup menu, and what I want to do is again show you some of the things that I think are relevant to shooting with this camera system. So you'll see that there are pages, and what I really like about these pages is you don't scroll up or down. So they are categorized based on a certain number of parameters that you can change, and you don't have to scroll up and down in these. You just swipe left or right to get to all of the settings within each of those sections. So page 1 of camera setup, we can go in and make changes to things having to do with zoom parameters. So for instance, under digital zoom, we have 300x and we have a 2x digital teleconverter option. Under zoom rocker, zoom speed, that would have to do with the speed of the zoom rocker on the camera body. But we could also go ahead and change parameters having to do with the handle rocker zoom speed, which would be part of the handle unit of the camera system. One other thing here, we have a wireless controller zoom speed. You have this little remote that comes with the camera, and this would actually have to do with the speed on the zoom plus and minus having to do with the remote control. So if I step out of there and I now swipe over to the second page of camera setup, these are parameters that we're going to get into in depth in another video in the series, but they have to do with autofocus functionality. So for instance, if I wanted to access face detection and tracking, I could turn that on and off very simply here in that menu item. We're going to swipe to page 3, and this has to do with things like your focus preset speed. So for instance, if I am using autofocus on the camera system, is that doing that slowly, in a normal speed, or quickly? Also, we have options like conversion lens. If I'm using this teleconverter, it's an optical teleconverter that's designed as an accessory specifically to the camera, the TLU58, then I would go ahead and choose TLU58 and attach this lens. If I were going to attach the WAU58, which is the wide converter, then I would go into the menu system and do that. And that's basically telling the 400 or the 405 that we are attaching different optics to the camera, and it will make adjustments accordingly when you're using those. And additionally in here, we have our image stabilizer options in terms of turning that off, our standard, so sort of normal situations, and then dynamic when we're moving the camera very quickly. We're going to swipe to the last page of camera setup. This is where we choose things like our white balance priority, our focus ring direction, which we can change, the response of the focus ring. So for instance, if we wanted to, we could make that response slow, normal, or fast. If you were somebody who wanted to turn the focus ring further in order to get focus, then you would set it to slow. If you wanted to turn it less to get focus, then you would turn it to fast. Most situations, normal is going to be fine. And then this is also where we're going to get into things like turning on our infrared light, which is in the front of the camera system. We'll talk about that in another video. And also what the record color is going to be when you're using infrared recording. We can choose white or we can choose green. Now that we're done with the camera setup menus, we're going to go into recording setup. And I do want to spend a considerable amount of time going into this with you because it's very important in terms of how you set up the camera. First option under the first page of recording setup is internal external recording. So the way this works is by default, you're on internal recording priority, which has to do with recording to the SD cards. If you're on the XF405 and you want to use the external SDI, 3G SDI out, then you would choose external recording only, SDI. and then you would be spitting out a full HD 10-bit 422 output from that terminal. If you are on either the 400 or the 405 and you want to use the HDMI 2.0 terminal and you want to do external recording, you would choose external recording only HDMI. And remember that when you're choosing those options, you can still see your picture on the screen for the camera system. You can see all of your settings, but you are recording externally to another device or using it in a broadcast type environment. So we're going to go back to our internal recording priority option because we want to record to the internal SD cards. And now we're going to talk about resolution. And we have 5 choices here. 2 of them are 720 and 2 of them are 1080 full HD. And then 1 of them is our UHD 4K option. That's what we have chosen right now. So it's a 3840 by 2160 16 by 9 image that's being recorded at 150 megabits per second. And if we are doing 4K internally, that's what we're going to choose. We can also choose 1920 by 1080, and it will essentially do a quick reboot, but without turning the camera off, just to make sure that those settings are there. And now we're recording at 35 megabits per second internally. You could record at a lower data rate, 17 megabits per second, but normally if we're shooting in full HD, internally to the SD cards, we'll be choosing 1920 by 1080, 35 megabits per second. And if we're shooting in UHD 4K, we would be at 150 megabits per second. So that's our resolution set. Frame rate, we have 3 options. We have 23.98, we have 29.97, and we have 59.94, all progressive. We do, of course, have other frame rate options in this camera, which we'll talk about in another video. For instance, in full HD, we can record up to 120 frames per second. And of course, in UHD 4K, up to 60 frames per second. So we step out of frame rate here. So then we can go into our MP4 audio format, and we have 2 choices here. We have LPCM 16-bit 4-channel, and we also have AAC 16-bit 2-channel. In most situations for me, and my recommendation would be to use the 4-channel setting. That allows you to record to the stereo mic that's built in, and we're also recording a less compressed version of our audio using LPCM when we're using the XLR inputs on the camera system. So let's go ahead and talk about recording media, because this is pretty interesting and it's going to tie in directly to dual relay recording. So when I go into recording media, I can choose where my movies are recorded to, card A or card B, and also where my photos are recorded to, card A or card B. So for instance, if I wanted to choose my memory card B slot, I would choose that here in this menu item. Now I'm going to back out of here and go to dual relay recording. And right now I have the camera set to relay recording, which means that when it gets to the end of my chosen slot's card and its capacity, in this case, I chose slot B. If there is a card in slot A, it will span the clip if I'm still recording, and it will start to record onto card A. If I had chosen slot A as my recording card first, it will span to card B, or on the B card slot, as long as it's a card in that slot and it is the right type of card. Second option, standard recording. This is like a tape. If you start recording on a card and stop recording and start recording, when it gets to the end of that card's capacity, it will just stop. It will not span to another card on a different slot. And then my favorite, dual recording. This is recording the same resolution and the same data rate to both cards that are inside of the camera system. Most of the time when we're shooting with a camera like this, again, we're in a small to no crew situation. We're not pulling cards and data wrangling in those situations. So having the exact same information on both cards is a huge advantage to us in production, and one of my favorite ways to record with cameras like this and also any of the Cinema EOS cameras. So now we're going to go to our second recording setup menu, and right now we don't have access to slow and fast motion because we are in UHD 4K, so we can shoot up to 60p in that situation, which we would do on the prior menu. But if we were shooting in full HD, that would be an option, and we'll talk about that in another video. But there's other stuff in here. We have our available space in memory, so we can choose each of our cards and it will tell us how much in terms of our chosen resolution and our bit rate we can actually record to each of those cards, what's left, and also how many photos. And then we'll back out of that. This is also where we initialize our memory cards. I'm definitely not going to do that right now, but my recommendation would be once you have your cards backed up to at least 2 locations, then you put your cards back into the camera and you initialize them before you start shooting with them again. And also in this menu, we have HDMI timecode, which we can use to push timecode over the HDMI 2.0 terminal if we are using an external recorder or if we are using the camera in a broadcast style situation. Third recording setup menu, this really has to do with timecode. So I'm just going to go over a couple of things with you that are important to me when I'm using cameras like this. If I go into timecode running mode, we have 2 options. We have rec run and we have free run. Rec run is start-stop timecode. We start at 0, it goes to 1 minute and 3 seconds and 22 frames. And then when we stop and then we start again, it's at 1 minute and 3 seconds and 23 frames in terms of where it starts again. So it's start-stop. Free run is timecode that just continues. And normally when we set our camera to free run timecode, what we'll do is we will go into, in this camera, initial timecode, and we will set it to what we call time of day. So this is time of day free run timecode. And it's usually based on a 24-hour clock. So what we'll do is we will set it to whatever time it is. So right now it is about 5:05. So I'm just going to go down here to 17. And we're going to go up here to 05. And I'm just going to say OK. And if I step out of this menu here, you will now see that my time code is reading 1705. So we've basically got our hours, our minutes, our seconds, and our frames running here. So that is your time code menu. And now we go over to our 4th recording setup menu. And inside of here, we can actually send a 1 kilohertz tone. We can also change our file numbering on the camera system. And you can refer to the user manual if you want more information about that. This next menu, a lot of the options are going to be grayed out. This is our audio setup menu. When we plug in an external microphone or microphones to the camera system, this will light up. This is something that we are going to cover in a separate video in the series, but we do have 3 pages that will allow us to change the options that we have inside of the camera related to audio recording and also audio monitoring. Let's take a look at our output terminal options here, and we have 3 off, SDI or HDMI. If you are not going to be externally monitoring, then keep this off because anything you can do to save power with the camera system is a good idea. If you are using the 405 and you want to monitor externally, you can do that over SDI or you can do that over HDMI. The 400, of course, does not have the SDI terminal, so you can choose HDMI for that. Now, in terms of your HDMI 2.0 maximum resolution, you can set that to 1920 by 1080 or to 3840 by 2160. And if you want any more information about that, you can refer to the user manual. And just a couple other things inside of the display setup on this first page. We have our LCD brightness, which we can change. We can change our LCD backlight from either dim, normal, or bright, depending on our shooting situations. And we also have a viewfinder backlight, which has to do with the EVF that's built into the camera. Second page of display setup. This is where we have some additional functions. For me, one of the most important is whether or not we are outputting on-screen displays. If you are monitoring externally and you have a crew and you want them to see those settings, then you would turn those on-screen displays on. If you didn't want somebody to see it, for instance, you just wanted to push a clean image to a client, then you would turn that off. And backing out of there, we also have on-screen markers that we can turn on for the camera. And lastly, we have our distance units. We have it set here for feet, but we could quickly and easily change that to meters in the camera. Now, stepping out of here, we're going to go to the last section of our menu, which is our system setup. This is where we can set things on this first page like language, date and time, our network settings, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in another video. Also our fan. The fan is very quiet on this camera, and you can keep it running consistently if you want. But if we set that to automatic, then it's going to be monitoring the temperature of your environment, and it will only kick the fan in when it gets too hot. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that on automatic. And we also have our wireless remote control, so we can turn that on and off if we want to. And then additionally, when we get to our second page of system setup, we have things like the ability to turn on and off our tally lamp. Sometimes that's distracting to talent, so you can turn that off if you'd like. Remote terminal. We're going to be talking about using the RCV100 with this camera, and if we wanted to, we would have to turn that on inside of this menu. And then we get into assignable buttons. So we go into assignable button 1, and of course this corresponds to assignable button 1 on the camera system, and we can go in and we can choose exactly what we want that button to do. For instance, if I wanted button 1 to be used for magnification, I could choose that instead of AF/MF. I actually like that button used as a toggle between autofocus and manual focus, so I'm going to leave it on there. We're going to step out of there, and let's go to the third screen under System Setup, and we have all of our other assignable buttons, and we can change those. And for instance, if we wanted to change the on-screen assignable button, which is currently set to photo, I could set that to magnification, step out of there, and we will now see that that button is set to magnification, and I can access that, and then I can step out of there, and it's super easy to do that. The other thing we can do on our fourth screen here is we can actually go ahead and choose our backup menu settings. And this is really important because what we can do is we can take an SD card, put it into card slot B, and we can actually save our menu settings directly to this. So we can copy those to other cameras, or if it's just our favorite settings and then we want to change some things, we can always load those back onto the camera. Last thing on the last page I want to talk about is reset all. You're not going to do this very often, but if you do want to bring the camera back to its original settings, then you would choose that in this menu. So there you go. That is a tour of the menu for the XF400 and the XF405. Thanks for watching.